Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Somerfield, so I'm a heritage advisor for Canal and River Trust. As it says in the programme, Canal and River Trust is a private charity. It kind of looks after roughly about 2,000 miles of canal all across England and Wales. And it is what I would describe as the third largest heritage estate in the UK. There's a bit of competition between us and the National Trust, but the Church of England exists in first place by a country mile. I'm going to race through this presentation. We're already about 5 minutes due. I'm just conscious that Tim might have to compete with a very noisy sound check later on, so I'm going to try and give him a bit more time than normal. My title, Swings and Roundabouts, Conservation of Civil Engineering Structures. Swings and roundabouts hopefully kind of has the same meaning here as it does in across the border, as it were, which doesn't actually mean swings and roundabouts. It means essentially the sort of the culmination of successes and failures over time, really. And hopefully, as I go through the presentation, that'll make a bit more sense. I want to thank Hennep for kind of inviting us, Canal and River Trust. It kind of makes I think I'm here as a sort of outlier. I'm talking from what I would describe as the client side. So we have over the last 2 or 3 years worked with CPAT, with individuals like Tim, Chris, Yvonne, Matt. So lots of people from what is now Hennep, doing work for us that kind of filling gaps in our knowledge and helping us kind of do our work, specifically in the World Heritage Site here in Wrexham, but in other places too. So a bit of an agenda. I'm just going to do a quick professional background. I'm not an archaeologist, so I probably need to kind of do a little bit of that. I'm going to do a case study on Trevor Basin, a bit on the Poncasilthy Aqueduct, and then another bit on Trevor, a smaller bit, and then a bit on future possibilities. So hopefully it will all be of interest. I'm conscious you've all had coffee now. I'm glad I wasn't the graveyard shift after lunch, because this is very outlierish from what went on this morning. Although I was thinking that Susie described the new significance criteria as being partially made of metal and over 200 years old. I was thinking, wow, Poncasilthy Aqueduct is now treasure as well as a really important. So professional background. As I say, I'm an advisor to the trust. I kind of work as a sort of contract advisor, from the outside, if you like. But I also run a small consultancy in the Midlands, which is Hearts of England. And I was also, up until fairly recently, a board trustee of the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust. I have quite a lot of experience working in World Heritage Sites. I'm guessing that's why I got the gig here, to be fair. I cut my teeth in this World Heritage Site, which was very nice, very sunny in the Mediterranean. Some of you will already know this. This is the Valletta, so the Heritage Site in Malta, Valletta. This is the medieval wall, and if some of you have been lucky enough to go into the slide on the right-hand side, which is the Co-Cathedral of St. John, where they have their very own Caravaggio, which is it's really crucial. I've also worked in the World Heritage Site in Derbyshire, which is where I'm from, hence the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust connection. And so we've been, as the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust, we were advising Derbyshire County Council and various other people on the buildings there. This is Leewood Pumping House on the left-hand side, and the much contentious East Mill in Belper. And then my work as I say, I'm not an archaeologist by trade. I was trained as a art historian originally, and then I sort of ended up being a surveyor of historic buildings. But in between that, I worked in corporate research and in the think tank industry. So it's kind of a bit odd, a bit circuitous route to get to where we are now. But my work is mainly looking at historic buildings and providing specifications and advice on how they should be conserved or renovated, or whichever one of those terms. This one was a building I worked on within the World Heritage Site in Derbyshire, so in the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site. It's what we refer to as Aqueduct Cottage. It was once owned by a less famous Peter Nightingale, who was a sort of landowner and canal builder. He had a very famous niece who stayed here quite a lot, as I'm sure you will all know her name. She was young Florence. I was brought into this project to source and ensure that we got these very rare free birch stone tiles onto the roof. I don't know whether you know about free birch tiles, but the quarry's now been closed for years, so it was quite hard to get, but essentially we managed to do it. In fairness, there's a bit of smoke and mirrors here. They're only on the front, slates on the back. That's how hard they are to get. So Trevor Basin. I'm sure all of you, most of you will have been to the World Heritage Site, and you certainly know Trevor Basin. This is how it looks today, which is a very tranquil sort of site where you can moor your narrowboat and spend a great deal of time. But historically, as I'm sure you all know, this was probably the most intensive commercial site in the region by far for a long period of time. So definitely didn't look like this. It wouldn't have been a very nice place to be. But this is a site where we, as Canal and River Trust, we're the owners of the asset. It's a scheduled monument. It's in a World Heritage Site. It's in a conservation area. It's a SAC. It's a triple SI. I often argue it's the most designated site anywhere on the canal network in the UK, and that's definitely true. And our problems there are numerous, in the sense we're doing lots of projects there at the moment, or we have been over a period of time. This project seems to have been ongoing for years, and the reason for that is largely COVID. So this project was initiated in 2019. It was just about get going in January, February 2020, and then you all know what happened next. And then I got put onto the job in early 2022, I think. And we were just about to start digging the foundations for the revetment wall, which is essentially a building. It's relocating Anglo-Welsh, which is one of the tenants we have on this site. And we needed to build a large revetment wall, and we needed CPAT, as they were then, to come in and help us do a little bit of watching brief. And in that watching brief, we found what you can see on the slides as a sort of relatively nice wharf area, really. So lots of wharf stone initially. They were a bit haphazard, as I'm sure Chris will vouch. We dug up lots of little things here and then found this wharf, and we kind of stumbled a little bit and then moved along the wharf. And as we moved along the wharf, we found some more interesting items or finds. So on the left-hand side, we think I think we probably still do, it's currently in conservation with the very experienced Rowan Taylor, as a blacksmith who works at the Ellesmere Yard site in Canal and River Trust. So what we think is part of what was the Ruaban tramway rail. So a piece of rail with a fish plate you can see at the bottom there. We took out those stones. We've documented all that material. You can see it on the left-hand side just before it was ready for transportation to its safer sites. As I say, we had lots of conversations with CADU at the time. With CPAT were involved in those conversations. And we decided that we were going to put those stones back in some way, shape, or form. It's quite complicated because it's going to be a wharf area where we need disabled access, which is quite tricky, really. Imagine these stones going back down. They're not going to create a surface that one could easily access. So we're currently in negotiation, but we found a sort of way through all of that. My view is it's a little bit contrived, but I think sometimes these things always are. But nevertheless, we are going to put some of those stones back. And the rail, we think we're going to probably put in an education centre that's kind of due to be given permission, let's say, in the World Heritage Site. So watch this space. But my problems are usually these problems, which is failed wash wall is usually. Now, usually I turn up at a failed wash wall and think, okay, we can just rebuild that. In this case, that's kind of slightly more tricky because this is a scheduled monument wash wall in a World Heritage Site. It's a conservation area and all the things I've just said. So to rebuild this wash wall usually requires CADU intervention and usually requires a load of stakeholders to understand how we go about doing that. But we managed to get through all that, but we realised as we started to rebuild this bit of wash wall that there was a significant problem with it, which is essentially it was lying on what we describe as a clay foundation. And that was partly the reason for its collapse, I think. There was some surcharge there as well, but we think partly due to a bit of what we call prop wash, where boats are sitting moored at the side of this wall and their propellers are running because they're running their boats. And essentially you create a wash, and what happens is pulls clay out of underneath the wall, and therefore you get essentially the subsidence that you just saw. So we rebuilt this wall, and with CADU's permission, we kind of put a sort of reasonably sized concrete foundation. You can see that concrete foundation on the left-hand side there. But in that process, we realised that there was a number of other failures. So if you think about Trevor Basin, it doesn't look it, but it's actually got quite a lot of water in it. Water tends to do a really good job in holding historic structures upright. And as soon as you take the water out, you take the pressure away, and the walls go, actually, that's been holding us up, Mark, so we're going to fall down. And that started to happen en masse, as I'm sure Chris will attest. When we were there, we were actually seeing stones literally fall in real time while we're standing in the navigation. So we started to think about how we could extend the scope of these works and maybe use this opportunity. So we don't get the water out of a place like Trevor Basin very often. I mean, it's quite cumbersome to do that. You've got to get fish rescue. You've got to do a whole host of things to do that. Put dam in. It's quite complicated. So while we were in there, we thought we'd actually do a bit more work. So this is essentially the rebuilding of the bit that was broken, if you like. But then on the other side, you've got what I described at the time and still describe now as probably one of the best 18th century wash walls I've ever seen in the canal. This is on the opposite side of where we just saw that collapse, so still in Trevor Basin. limestone wall with its original non-hydraulic mortar, which is quite surprising given it's got water on it all the time, and it's still in reasonably good condition. But the reason for that is it sits on bedrock rather than on clay. So it's got a really nice batter on it. It's been stable over all these years, and it's retained its form. Whereas on the other side of the basin, so literally, less than 10 meters away, you've got clay foundations, and you've got clay foundations on the peninsula. And what's happening there is that those clay foundations have been washed away. As you can see, you've got lots of collapses on the peninsula and on the right-hand side where we were actually doing the work. And so we got CPAT in, or Heneb in, to kind of do some strata work for us, and Chris came in, and with some other guys, I think Yvonne was involved at the time. And we also got Matt in to do some photogrammetry for us. So while we got the water out, we're trying to do as much as we can to gain as much knowledge as we could about this structure and what we would need to do to put it right in the immediate term, and then potentially what it might need in the long term. You can see the gap underneath the wall. I've sort of highlighted there. That's just alongside from where you can just see the edge of the collapse, can't you, on the right hand side there? But you can see underneath, you can see a sort of void, and that void is where we needed to sort of focus our attention based on some of the information that CPAT were giving us at the time. As I say, Matt came and did quite some really good photogrammetry for us, actually. This is at the top of the slide. You can see the wall I was just describing. Again, best 18th century wash wall I've seen for my time in Canal and River Trust, and then a sort of spread of the peninsula. But you can see at the bottom of there, you can see quite a lot of collapses. You can also actually see quite an interesting evolution of that wall, can't you? You can see the limestone up to a certain point, then more sandstone, and then on top of that. The reason for that, and this is largely the problem with the other side of the site where we were doing the relocation works, is that the canal over the 200-year periods of being there constantly has to be dredged. And the dredgings don't usually go far. They usually just get piled onto the land. So what you've got is made up land, keep getting higher and higher and higher. And essentially, so this wall has to keep up with that made up land to kind of keep it there. And that's why I think, and remember, Chris will vouch for this, I think when we actually hit the wharf on the relocation stuff, we were quite surprised, weren't we? It was almost at water level, so there was no freeboard at all. It was actually, they were operating the wharf directly at water level. There was no gap as freeboard as what we describe as now. So again, these stabilisation works, we spent we extended the scope of these works significantly. It's significant time, significant cost. If you imagine, this is one of the busiest canals on the network. Convincing all the powers that be, not only the executive at Canal and River Trust, but also all the business owners, Anglo-Welsh, and a whole host of others who operate in this area, that we're going to have to keep the water out because we're going to have to try and repair this thing. It's sometimes really difficult. So you're managing multiple stakeholders all the time when you're doing this work, as well as people like CADU and ICOMOS UK and UNESCO and all the obvious ones that are part of the inscription for the World Heritage Site. And the solution was what I would call a very conservation-friendly solution, dreamt up by myself and an engineer, which is essentially we put soliform bags as a sort of makeshift concrete wall in front of it. I don't know whether you know soliform bags. They're essentially concrete inside this sort of Hessian sack, and when you put them in water, they solidify. But then what we did is we put that wall in a sort of brick bond in front of it, and then we put bentonite clay pellets behind that. So we reinforced the clay, but then put almost like a concrete stopper, so essentially creating a fillet. And that's a sort of really good way of providing a temporary / permanent solution to a problem where we would have to have been relatively invasive to kind of do work there. Taking down that entire scheduled monument at that end of the basin would have been costly, and I suspect CADU wouldn't have been particularly happy with us doing that. It's not an easy thing to do. So I think they were at the time really happy with this solution. I've used this solution on a number of occasions, not necessarily in places as highly designated as the World Heritage Site, but essentially this provides us with a really good 100% reversible solution to resolving that particular problem of collapsing wash walls. And there's the wall, the bit that I showed you at the beginning, completely redone with its new oak fenders and so on and so forth. I mean, if you imagine one of the problems we have, and it might not seem obvious, if you were standing in Trevor Basin, I think you probably would do from the sound they make, but narrowboats generally look to most people like quite benign craft. They only move to around 5 miles an hour, they don't make a lot of noise. But believe me, when they hit a wall, they're usually like 15, 20 tons. They give walls a good bang when they do. They usually cause quite a lot of damage, hence the need for things like these oak fenders that kind of at least try and provide a buffer to keep this scheduled monument in the kind of condition that Cadw expect us to keep it in. Now onto the sort of bigger bit, if you like. So the world famous Ponkasilta aqueduct, which is recently described by UNESCO as within this field, so industrial archaeology, not only the best in the UK or best in England and Wales, but best in the world. So I think in a sense, Wrexham, I'm sure everyone in Wrexham is reasonably proud as it is of the football stadium next door or the football team next door. But I think this is a significant piece of civil engineering, as I say, not just in England and Wales, but in the world. We have lots of people coming all over the world to see this structure, and it's kind of really important that we maintain it. It's a Canal and River Trust, but essentially that people in Wrexham expect us to maintain it in the way that it should be maintained. And here it is. The very famous piece of treasure now, as I'm describing it, because I think it's partially made of metals, 200 years old. It kind of fits that significance criteria really well. The thing I think, just to try and ignore the structure, do what Steve was saying earlier when he was talking about his ground scans, which is just blink a little bit or wince a little bit, and you'll see the really good thing about this picture is you see the form of the handrail. The parapet handrail is kind of really important. It's a thing that we spend most of our time on. To be honest with you, the rest of the structure looks after itself, but the handrail does not. And so we have to do quite a lot of repairs to it. But if you squint and look at it, you can see that the gaps between the uprights are kind of not very uniform. Some of them are actually, they look as if they're at a sort of degree angle of about 20 degrees, because some of them are. This causes us quite a lot of problems. I think I was telling a gentleman in the audience earlier today, the height of the parapet doesn't cause us any problems because it was originally designed to keep horses on there rather than humans. But the gaps or the non-uniformity of the gaps in between the handrails does cause us quite a lot of problems, because small children and small dogs can get through those gaps quite easily. And you can imagine, I've often walked along there where I've seen children of 5 or 6 years old not even holding the hands of their parents. Heaven forbid one of them were to get through a gap like that. It's 126 feet down to a very rocky end. So it's the thing that keeps us awake at night. And we have lots of sort of local problems to deal with in that area, where there's lots of cultural, let's call them cultural initiations between the teenagers who believe it's necessary to climb on the offside of the handrail and film themselves going across it on their mobile phones, which is has caused, in some instances, I'm sure the locals will know, has caused at least one death in the last 10 years. It's a very dangerous activity. But in the sense, if we think about the work that we do on it, so generally the maintenance, I think I was trying to sort of describe this the other day, really, which is, if we think about it now, if we ever said, certainly to the people of Wrexham, that we were, this thing is no good, we're going to get rid of it, we're going to knock it down, I'm sure there'd be somewhat of an uproar. But certainly in the interwar years, so in the first 50 years of the 20th century, this thing was nearly falling down. It was kind of, it's in really bad condition. It wasn't even navigable. Famously, Tom Rolt, who sort of instigated almost single-handedly the sort of narrowboat industry as we know it now. He tried to cross it in 47, couldn't cross it, tried to cross it again in 49, just about got across. It wasn't, it was in really bad state. And then you see these photographs here, these are from the archives. I think the one on the left is probably from the early 50s. So Canal and River Trust, Canal and River Trust comes out of what used to be called the British Waterways Board. The British Waterways Board didn't really come about till 63. So at this point, it was kind of being looked after probably by some elements of the Welsh state or local government. And so obviously repairs were taking place. You can see that it's dewatered to some extent, and so repairs were taking place. On the right hand side, you can see that the towpath has lost all its what we call its dish plates. So it was kind of going through some repair. I think that photograph's a little bit later. I think that is from the early 60s, that photograph. And then restoration work was done in the 1980s. Ove Arup did some of that work with British Waterways Board. And then in 2003, 2004, remember, it was a scheduled monument at this point, but it wasn't a World Heritage Site. It went through a significant restoration. Some people locally might even remember it. It was scaffolded all the way across in its entire length. It was largely completed by this contractor, a guy I'd call RTT, so Richard Thomas, with Canal and River Trust, with British Waterways engineers. and went through a really significant restoration, repaired quite a lot of stuff that had sort of gone by the wayside, really. So it's I think it saved it at this point. So we're talking early 21st century. Interestingly, you can see that Richard's actually standing on the towpath there. There's a level change. It might not seem obvious, but there's a level change. He's standing on the towpath, and the dish plates, so the steel plates in between the cantilevered cross members, they were paid for by Cadw, actually, a significant amount. There's about 302 of those, I think, across the whole aqueduct. Steel dish plates that have a sort of rise in them, so when water gets onto them, that water is able to run away and back into the canal. And Cadw paid for those at that time. It shows you that they were keen to kind of ensure that they supported us in repairing this structure in the best way that we could, because it genuinely can easily suck up the GDP of a small country every time you look at it, to be honest with you, if I'm telling the truth. So as I said earlier, it is actually the parapet handrail that causes us most of our difficulty in terms of restoration. And we have to replace a lot of the handrails now. You can see here, this is a scenario where we try and keep most of the uprights if we can. We weld small pieces on top of them, but we replace the long piece of handrail. It's a long and time-consuming task. We do it in January, in between January and March. I was thinking about what Ian said earlier, and he was complaining about the wind at Boris Quarry. I can assure you, I'll trade that wind for you any day of the week. On top of the aqueduct in January, when it's usually snowing, raining, and windy all in the same minute, it's kind of it can be a really difficult environment to work in. But we're doing hot works at that point. So we've got welding equipment, we've got boats there. We're all strapped to the boats to make sure we don't fall off. It is very, very dangerous work. And you can see here a sort of indication of what I was just describing. Just to lift one of those handrails, and I've got one in a small part of it in the enterprise zone down the corridor there. They are extremely heavy. It takes 4 guys to lift one of those handrails to offer them up to be situated on top of the uprights. And here's a sort of before and after. This is what we're doing. We're trying to extend that. In some cases, we're trying to extend what we see as the expansion joint. So sometimes if you're on the aqueduct in the middle of summer, you'll look down the handrail and it kind of goes a bit like that. And that's because in the summertime, the sun heats it up, and then those expansion joints contract. It kind of butt up against each other, it buckles, and it causes quite a lot of damage to the actual uprights or down below. So we're trying to extend those expansion joints and put in a greater slip in underneath that. So a strip that kind of clamps those two together allows the expansion joint to kind of work much better. So essentially before and after. But we're also sort of I'd say, COVID kind of complicated this bit, but usually every 5 or 10 years we do what we call a principal inspection. And that is where we take the water out of it, we kind of shut it down, and we kind of crawl all over it with hundreds of engineers, trying to make sure that we're sending people in boats over a structure that's 126 feet in the air. We have to be sure that those boats aren't going to fall off there, or anyone's going to fall off there. So we have to keep replacing. The picture here, I've got a couple of them down in the enterprise zone, but these bolts that bolt the trough together often refer to the Poncasilty aqueduct as essentially a very big Meccano set. It's kind of what it is, and most of it's bolted together with these bolts. And there's roughly, we don't know how many, but I think there's roughly about 11,000 of these bolts in the entire structure. So, and we have to periodically check every single one of those bolts to make sure it's not going to fail. And you can see here a sort of a grade of, I think the ones on the very right hand side, I think the ones I've brought with me today aren't original from the Jessup and Telford construction in 1805. They're from the William Baker restoration in 1860, because they've got cork on, as some of these have as well. Oakum on as a sort of water agent, water sealing agent. But the ones on the left-hand side, those bolts on the left-hand side, they might have been from the original, actually, because they're extremely worn down. But the ones I've got with me today, they were taken off in 2003, 2004, and I think they were from about the 1860s. And then you've got a brand new one on the far side here. They're wrought iron. We have to have each of these made in wrought iron. It's, again, very expensive process. Here's us doing bits of principal inspection, trying to clean all the mud and all the stuff that gets out of it. You wouldn't believe how many mobile phones we dragged out of it this time around. We even found an iPhone 15. It'd been in there a long time, and we managed to plug it in, and it still worked, which was, it's crazy. Honestly, did you see any of those when you were there, Chris? We looked at some mobile phones, didn't we? Honestly, the things we find in there is quite incredible. Anyway, so this is us crawling all over the structure, and once we've taken the water out. And we're looking at lots of different things that quite famously on the right-hand side, we're looking at the plug. It's essentially a very big bath. You pull the plug, all water falls out. That's kind of how it works. But on the left-hand side, we're looking, you can just about see it actually. You look in the top left-hand corner, you can see what we call the ledger angle. Can you see how that's snapped? Can you see the break? Top left-hand corner. And so that's the thing we're looking at in this instance, the ledger angles and these cross members. These cross members are the thing that keep the towpath. So it's cantilevered over with some uprights that kind of hold it up at periodic places all the way along the aqueduct. We're checking those for strength and for movement. And they're held in place. I'll get to it in a second. They're held in place by a sort of wrought iron strap. They have been failing quite a lot. We have had to put some remedial works in there, temporary remedial works to ensure that they don't move. Here's the sort of big Meccano set, if you like. So these are the cast iron plates on the side of the aqueduct that are bolted together. You can see they've got numbers on, so it's literally built by numbers. You've got a 2, a 3, and then an N, meaning north. So essentially they were bringing from the site there just to Plaskeniston. It was being made literally very nearby and then brought to the site and bolted together. That's it. That's a very big Meccano set, is how I can describe it. These are the things that surprise me, actually. And I think Chris and I and Tim and I and all the people from Heneb who were kind of involved in recording this. So Matt did quite a lot of photogrammetry for us here. Yvonne came in and did some documentary work of the cast iron, some of the cast iron failures that we got, which were casting error or casting mistakes. But these are quite interesting, and it took us a long time to work out what these were. They look smaller than they actually are. I'll show you another slide where they appear quite bigger. They're essentially a wrought iron strap at the bottom of the aqueduct, directly underneath the towpath. And what they were, they appear now to be almost like a belt, if you like. And because they were wrought iron, they could be heated up and kind of almost shaped around what we call a sole plate. And that sole plate was the original towpath from 1805. The original towpath from 1805 wasn't cast iron, it was actually made of timber. And Baron Dupin recorded in about 1916 that he walked across it and he recorded it being a timber towpath. So the cast iron rail, the uprights and the parapet handrail were cast iron, but the actual path, the cantilevered bit that you walk on, that was actually made of timber. And obviously after about 25 years that would have failed. That's pretty much the case. We make lots of lock gates out of the same type of oak. Every 20 years we have to replace them. They kind of deteriorate and fail. And I think what happened is because these bolted into the main trough, they were just left there. So the sole plate rotted around them. They kind of left them all in situ. And so they wouldn't take them out because taking them out would essentially cause a potential leak problem because they're kind of bolted into the trough. So they've all essentially been left in place. I was quite surprised to see them, actually. They are very interesting elements and obviously original from the original construction, finished in 1805. These are the cast iron straps. If you look on the left-hand side, you can see one is actually broken, and they just hold the uprights in place. So they're wrought iron. They have to be made of wrought iron because they need to be quite flexible. If they were made of cast iron, they'd be too brittle and they would snap. So they have to be made of wrought iron, and they fail over a period of time. I think this one's probably I think this one was from the 1960s. These ones a little bit later. And so we had to find out which ones were failed, which ones were about to fail, and we had to make some quick decisions, again with CADO's approval, to temporarily chock those uprights up, as you can see here with these wooden chocks. It's really, as down and dirty as conservation work gets. We actually clamped them together with G-clamps we bought from a hardware store. That's how down and dirty it is. So in a sense, it's just to give that upright a bit of stability over a period of time until we can get the water out again and put new ones. We've already had the wrought iron ones made, and we'll get the water out within a couple of years and put those back. Again, just everyone always asks me about the drain plug. It's this obsession, certainly in these parts. Even Ray was mentioning it earlier. He was talking to me about emptying the water out. And the drain plug has been seized over a period of time. Again, while we were in there this time, we unseized it. There is an issue of discharge from this canal. It's quite odd. I'm sure most of you know that the water that comes onto the Llangollen Canal, used to be the Ellesmere Canal, comes from Horseshoe Falls, so directly from the River Dee. But NRW do not like us putting that water back into the River Dee at this point, which is a bit odd because just up the way from here, there's a weir and we're discharging that water into the Dee almost 365 days a year when it overflows. So we're in a sort of dispute at the moment with NRW about a potential discharge license, but we think we have a license to do it. They don't think we do. But essentially, next time we take the water out, we want to use the drain plug, so we unseized it because I think it's actually, I'm sure many of the locals will attest, it's quite a spectacle when the water comes out of the aqueduct. It literally pours over the side. If you go on YouTube, you'll find many videos of the aqueduct being emptied via the plug. I think Ray was telling me that whose sister was it, Ray, who we were talking about? It was Prescott, John Prescott's sister, who'd emptied it at one point locally. So it's obviously like switching on the Christmas lights around here. Then you get to, you get to empty the plug on the aqueduct. How am I doing for time? So I just wanted to go back to Trevor and the public realm, because there's actually a bit that we've been working on very, very recently, actually. And it's uncovered a bit more of what you might describe as traditional archaeology, rather than this 126 feet above ground archaeology that I've just been talking about. So we're actually rerouting this path that runs down the side of the aqueduct and links with what we call the Teemau Country Park path. So it's a public footpath that runs directly under the aqueduct, goes to Teemau Country Park. This path, I'm sure those of you who have used it recently will attest it's not the safest of paths to travel down. So we are rerouting it. We are going to put new material down. But in that process, we had lots of conversations with Cadu. We've actually got a little bit of sort of unwanted erosion on one of the pillars. You can see where the path goes really tightly to the pillar here, and you can see in the far right-hand side, you can see that little bit of erosion. This is not, don't get me wrong, this is not malicious activity. This is not Berlin Wall-esque. People aren't taking bits of the aqueduct home with them. It's just general erosion from rucksacks or people bumping into it. So we're sort of redirecting the path to a certain place, and because we're doing that, we had some work done, some investigative work done that Chris did for us, again by Heneb, that sort of said, where we're going to put this path and what might be in its way. And Chris found some quite interesting stuff that we kind of knew about but didn't really know about, and we still don't really know about it. And that's the point about, I think, working with Heneb directly, is actually they're starting to fill in the gaps in our knowledge, trying to help us understand the site and help us develop that site better. So here, Chris identified that we've got some masonry that you can see from the raging pole on the left-hand side, is just behind the raging pole, that we think might be some form of incline plane, stroke revetment wall, some structure underneath the surface that could be uncovered and could tell us more about possibly how the aqueduct was constructed, or bits of water, essentially water direction. There's bits of water direction all the way around there, sort of various sort of streams and so on and so forth. So it may have been part of that. But again, it's kind of things that are kind of lying under the ground just at the surface. As Caroline and Steve were saying earlier, that if we just did a little bit of vegetation removal, we'd find some really interesting stuff. And I think this is actually an interesting point. I think what we'll do is we're about to start delivery on rerouting that path, I think, the early part of next year, I think. And I think the expectation, certainly my expectation as an advisor to the trust, is we'll have a watching brief there, and actually anything we find, we'll then start to think about how that stuff can be uncovered and then potentially interpreted. So that's sort of work to come, I think. And that links quite nicely on to my last bit of the slides, which is kind of future possibilities, really. And I was trying to think about this area and think about my work as sort of advisor on historic buildings. And there's quite a few things locally I could have picked, at least half a dozen things that I'm interested in locally that aren't necessarily CRT assets, but essentially stuff that link to the canal in some way, or essentially have sort of canal forms to them. And the first one is the Frood Canal, which is essentially a canal that was built north of here, and it was eventually supposed to link with Trevor Basin and obviously Wrexham and then potentially Cheshire. That was the original part of the Ellesmere Canal, was always designed to go much further than the aqueduct. When you think about the aqueduct itself, I mean, it's a very big undertaking, a huge cost. £47,000 was a great deal of money in the late 18th and early 19th century. But it's a bridge to nowhere really now, isn't it? It kind of stops, you get across it, you're in Trevor Basin. Trevor Basin became an extremely important transshipment area for coal, for limestone, for all the things that came from the area around where we are. But the idea really was to link that canal with Wrexham and essentially go on to Cheshire, to link all the canals and take you up to essentially the Shropshire Union and up to Ellesmere Port. So that stuff could be traded internationally. That didn't happen due largely to a pesky little Frenchman who decided to kick off a war with us, really. And so all the resources for this and all the money for this kind of dwindled away, and people's ambition for kind of linking these canals faded. But at that time, the Frood Canal was kind of partially built, about 3 miles of it, just north of here. It never connected up to Trevor Basin, never connected up further north of there, kind of existed on its own. It existed for a period of time where people were using it to move goods around the area, but it never connected to the canal network. It was essentially a canal at a dead end either side, but actually still exists. In some places, you can actually walk inside the navigation. You can walk to various parts of the basin. You'd have to have a very big some very big wellies on, or at least some waders, but nevertheless you can get in it. Some of it's actually been covered up by a sort of big, large housing estate in various places. But you can still, if you look at the topography there, you can still see the embankment and various things that were built to do it. I think it seems to me that not a lot of investigation has been done on this area. I mean, it links to various industries around there as well. But actually, I think this could be a site of more interest. Could it eventually link up with the World Heritage Site? Probably not, because you can't get it from there to here. But it could become a sort of annotated bit to the World Heritage Site eventually. I think it is of interest. I don't know whether you know the historian Peter Brown. He's been doing quite a bit of work on it in the past. So I think hopefully there are people locally I know doing work on it. But as someone who's interested in canals and the history of canals, it seems to be of interest. The second thing is, much nearer to the aqueduct itself, is the Calvinist Methodist chapel on the slip. I was talking to Susie. Susie mentioned Calvinist chapels, and I thought she was talking about this one, but she wasn't. She was talking about her own home. This is definitely not her home, as you can see. But this is quite an interesting structure from a history point of view. Obviously, has a relationship with the aqueduct, a relationship with the building of the aqueduct, but it's now largely ruinous, really. And I think the question now becomes: do we let this sort of fade into a sort of Ruskin-esque style decay, or do we do something about it to treasure it? I don't know what the answer to that is, but it feels to me as if this is prime for some investigation or some further work to understand how at least the structure gets stabilized. It's currently being held together by vegetation and scaffold, as you can see. So it could be in a lot better condition, I think. So in summary, swings and roundabouts. What were swings and roundabouts about? Well, I think I was trying to think about my work, which is essentially conservation is difficult work. It's never black and white. It's always shades of grey. So sometimes we have successes, sometimes we have failures. They kind of balance themselves out over time, I think. But it's not a question of being, as I've said on my slides, it's not a question of win some, lose some. It's more akin to trial and error. Trying to understand how we can manage these big industrial archaeology, or this big industrial assets that are kind of really important to the world, and doing that as best we can. I suspect in 30 years' time, 40 years' time, someone's like, God, what's Mark doing there? He shouldn't have done that. He's caused all this damage. And I say that about people who went before me. But at the time now, with the knowledge that I have, with the knowledge that Henna provide for me as well, we try and use those gaps to try and make the best decisions we can. And I always think about Pevsner in this respect as a sort of art historian or an architectural historian, as I am. Pevsner used to say each case on its own merits, really. It's a kind of Alexander Pope quote, really. But in a sense, I think that's how I try and treat this. So, not one size fits all, but each case on its own merits. And I think to do that, to try and do that successfully, you need broad collaboration. Actually need, the people in this room and other stakeholders that support us in doing that. It can't be done just by Canal and River Trust. It can't be just done by CADU. It has to be done by a whole host of people that have views and how to keep these structures, or keep the industrial past alive to some extent. And that's me. Thank you for listening.